The entire stadium feels like a hungry animal. Floodlights blazing, flags whipping in the wind, insults raining down from the stands like invisible stones. On the bench, a striker with a sharp haircut, shining boots, and the face of a star gets the order every player dreams of hearing. Warm up, you're going on in the second half. This isn't happening just anywhere. It's happening in Brazil, the so-called land of football, the country that gave the world Pelé, Zico, Romario, Ronaldo, and so many other geniuses of the game. And it's exactly here, where talent is almost part of the national identity, that an unlikely character is about to prove that appearance, connections, and a silver tongue can be worth as much as a wonder goal. His name is Carlos Henrique Raposo. On paper, he's a striker. In the locker room, he's a star. In the official photos, a professional player. But down there on the touchline as he runs along the sideline, what he feels isn't a scorer's adrenaline. It's pure panic. He knows that if he actually touches the ball for more than 5 minutes, the whole show falls apart. That night, with a packed stadium demanding blood and a powerful club director demanding a goal, Carlos Kaiser has to make a choice in a matter of seconds. Face the truth inside the 4 lines, or invent one more perfect lie to survive in a country where football is sacred, and where he somehow managed to build an entire career without really playing football. Some made fortunes in seconds, others lied for years. Some fooled kings, others fooled the entire world. This isn't a channel about ordinary crimes. It's about brilliant lies, dirty moves, and dangerously clever minds. Real scams, legendary con men, and the dark side of money. Welcome to Dirty Game. On the training pitch of a big club in Rio de Janeiro, a teenager with wild hair and a strong build runs around the goalposts. He's wearing Botafogo's kit, his shirt soaked with sweat, his shorts tight around muscular legs. From a distance, he looks exactly like what everyone expects from a Brazilian football prodigy. Confident posture, athlete's body, perfectly tied boots. But there's one detail you'd miss if you only watched for a few seconds. In every drill that involves the ball, Carlos Henrique Raposo instinctively tries to stay as far away from the action as possible. He prefers fitness circuits, sprints, stretching. When the ball comes near, he hides behind someone, adjusts his socks, fiddles with his laces. His body is that of a player. His relationship with the ball is not. To understand how that kid ended up there, you have to go back a few years and a few hundred miles south, to a childhood marked by dirt roads, scrappy pitches, and a family that saw football as more than a game. They saw it as an escape. In Rio Grande do Sul, little Carlos grows up surrounded by stories of stars who changed their lives because of the ball. Poverty isn't some abstract idea. It's food being counted, hand-me-down clothes, parents whose jobs are always hanging by a thread. In a lot of homes, the dream is to have a doctor in the family. In his, the dream is to have a footballer. From early on, people notice his build and how easily he fits in with any group. Carlos is outgoing, funny, wins over adults and kids at the same speed. He's not the kind of boy who spends hours chasing a ball out of pure love for the game. What fascinates him isn't the first touch, the dribble, or tactics. What makes his eyes light up are other scenes. The imported car parked outside the stadium, the gold watch on a striker's wrist, the way players are treated in restaurants, parties, nightclubs. For him, football shows up less as a passion and more as a shortcut. The nickname Kaiser is born out of this mix of looks and a desire to be big. Some say it came from a distant resemblance to Beckenbauer, the elegant German defender known as Der Kaiser. Others swear it came from the popular beer brand, tying the surname Raposo to something strong, catchy, easy to remember. Either way, the nickname fits. In a world where names become brands, Kaiser sounds bigger than a poor kid from the outskirts. It sounds like a star's label, and he understands that fast. Brazil in the 70s and early 80s is the perfect ground for someone like him. Football is huge, but information control is tiny. There's no internet, hardly anyone tracks stats. Academy records are a mess. Clubs rely on recommendations, fixers, and connections. A friendly director, a persistent agent, or an influential ex-player is often enough to open doors. In this blurry environment where backroom deals matter as much as talent, the figure of a player who looks like a player has room to thrive. Kaiser picks up on this almost instinctively. Around him there are kids obsessed with the ball, training late, repeating drills, crying when they get cut. He sees another logic. If he has the right body, the right story, and the right connections, maybe he doesn't need to be the best on the pitch. He needs to be convincing off it. While others dream of scoring in a final, he starts dreaming of something else. Contracts, unveilings, photos in the shirt of big clubs. When the chance to join Botafogo's youth academy appears, the social leap feels huge. From a dusty field in the south to the training ground of one of the country's most traditional teams, with facilities, housing, official kit. At first, that's all the motivation he needs. The teenager runs, works hard, survives brutal training sessions. But as days go by, an uncomfortable truth sets in. Technically, he's behind. In scrimmages, he misses simple passes, loses 50-50s, gets tangled up in plays his teammates pull off naturally. The daily comparison with real talent is cruel. It's in this contrast that a new layer of Kaiser's personality starts to form. He could have just become another kid who gets released and goes back home carrying the frustration of not having made it. Instead, he focuses on what he is good at: presence. He becomes the funny guy in the locker room, the one who chats with staff, the favorite of fitness coaches, the kid who knows how to listen to other players' complaints. In training matches, he's still average, but in human dynamics, he starts to become indispensable. His move to Flamengo only deepens this process. If at Botafogo he already felt surrounded by talent, at the Red and Black club, it's almost a sentence. The technical level is even higher. The competition is brutal. There are teenagers there who in a few years will fill stadiums, wear the national team shirt, become idols. Kaiser realizes that among them, any flaw on the ball shows up under a spotlight. The pitch doesn't forgive. At the same time, the structure around football becomes clearer to him. Agents roam the corridors. Directors have lunch with players' parents. Favors are asked and granted. Low-voiced conversations decide who gets more minutes, who will be watched closely by the coach, who might get a chance in the first team. It's not a meritocracy. It's a mosaic of interests, promises, alliances, and appearances. And young Kaiser understands exactly where he can fit in. He starts treating his own body like a shop window. If the ball doesn't behave, the body has to impress. He trains hard physically, sculpts his muscles, cares about his haircut, and how he walks around the club. He learns the slang and banter of the dressing room, watches how the stars carry themselves, copies gestures, poses, speeches. In photos, he looks just as much like a player as any other prospect. In training footage, he hides in the defensive line or behind opponents, always a safe distance from the key play. It's in this period that the idea that will guide his whole life is born, quietly. Maybe he doesn't need to be a great player to live as if he were one. Maybe. In a messy and vain system like Brazilian football, it's enough to be convincing enough to walk through the right door, sign short-term contracts, last a few months, and leave before the ball exposes the truth. In the corridors of Botafogo and Flamengo, between locker room jokes and harsh looks during training, Carlos Henrique Raposo realizes the key isn't mastering the ball, it's mastering the character. When he goes back out to the training pitch, now with the nickname fully stuck, the Kaiser running around the goalposts is no longer just a kid chasing a dream. He's someone who started to see football as a stage, and if he wasn't given talent with the ball, he's willing to be something else entirely, the perfect actor in the role of a professional football player. On the training pitches of General Severiano, the late afternoon sun hits hard over dozens of boys. The sound of boots tearing the grass mixes with coaches shouting instructions. In the middle of that crowd, one detail stands out to anyone really paying attention. While some teenagers treat the ball like an extension of their own bodies, one of them is always just a little late to every play. He runs, he hustles, he marks, tracks back, but when the ball finally reaches him, He stumbles on the first touch, misses the simple pass, finishes with no power. That kid is Carlos Henrique, already known by everyone there by a nickname that sounds bigger than his football, Kaiser. In his first months in Botafogo's youth system, the illusion still holds. Just being part of a big Rio club is by itself a kind of victory for someone coming from the outskirts and the south of the country. The official kit, access to the facilities, sharing the pitch with kids already seen as the next big thing. All that feeds a feeling of belonging. But here, football isn't romanticized. It's measured in training sessions, in performances, in the way the coach's eyes light up or grow cold after each play. In every scrimmage, the same movie plays out. A midfielder dribbles 3 opponents with ease. A winger whips in a perfect cross. A striker brings the ball down on his chest and finishes like it's nothing. In the middle of all this, Kaiser becomes painfully aware of an uncomfortable truth. Technically, he's the worst player on the field. Not because he doesn't try, but because he just doesn't have the tools. His first touch is heavy. His decision-making is slow. There's no spark of improvisation. While others shine with almost any ball they get, he clings to what he does have: stamina, marking, lungs. In the locker room, the difference shows up in another way. Some boys are sought out by agents, pulled aside for private talks with club officials, praised out loud. That one's going far, people say. When Kaiser's name comes up, the sentence usually sounds different. He's a great guy, runs a lot, but the but hangs in the air. He hears it, and he understands exactly what it means. Moving to Flamengo later on feels like a fresh start. If at Botafogo he already felt surrounded by talent, in Flamengo's youth ranks it's like living in a permanent all-star camp. These are the kids who will soon win state titles, national trophies, some even world championships. The training is intense, the atmosphere is ruthless, and the coaching staff's eyes are even sharper. On paper, Kaiser has the ideal physical package: strong, well-conditioned, always present in the gym. On the pitch, it's the same story. The feeling of being the worst one with the ball starts to trail him like a shadow. In pickup games, the last names called when picking teams are always the same, and he starts to notice his is almost always left for the end. In full team sessions, the ball comes his way as little as possible. When another player messes up, people think, bad day. When he messes up, people think, this is just who he is. The first big heartbreak hits in a dry, almost bureaucratic way. On a regular day after another training cycle, Kaiser is called in for a quick talk. The reasoning is generic, polished. The club needs to trim the squad, give chances to those who produced more, stick with players who fit the profile to reach the first team. The phrases are vague, but the message is crystal clear. There's no plan for him. The dream of making it at a big club for most kids ends right there. For a lot of them, that kind of release is a silent death sentence. The boy goes back home, finds some regular job, plays weekend football, and spends the rest of his life carrying that almost inside his chest. Carlos Henrique has every reason to become one more in that statistic. But in that moment of being cut, a perception he'd been building for years comes roaring back. He may not be good with the ball, but he's really good at everything orbiting around it. When he leaves the clubs, he doesn't drop the player look. He keeps wearing new boots, team shirts, official track pants. Going to the same nightclubs as the stars, the same bars, the same gyms becomes part of a quiet strategy. Keep the image alive. If the pitch has rejected him, the world around football is still wide open. While ex-teammates drown in frustration, he spots a different logic. Professional football, especially back then, is a chaotic ecosystem, built partly on looks, reputation, and word of mouth. Directors trust recommendations, agents pad resumes, journalists repeat unchecked stories. In that environment, the line between reality and narrative is very blurry. So Kaiser decides he won't try to be something he can't sustain on the field. He'll be something he can sustain off it. He gets closer to more famous players, becomes the buddy of important people, shows up in photos, parties, pagode circles. When someone asks what club he's at, he never replies, "I'm without a team." There's always a club on the horizon, an offer being negotiated, an agent sorting out the details. Little by little, the lie becomes a resume. In that process, his body becomes a kind of business card. He trains hard, keeps in shape, shows off the muscles and the athlete's posture. The visual leaves no room for doubt. Anyone looking at him is convinced they're standing in front of a professional player. And in a world where appearances often count more than match stats, that matters. If a club needs a striker to fill out the squad, some director remembers, this guy Kaiser, big presence up front, came through Botafogo and Flamengo. Nobody asks how many games he played. Nobody checks how many goals he scored. The big conceptual turning point is born exactly from that insight. If he has the right body, the right story, and the right friends, there will always be a short-term contract waiting somewhere. It's not about building a solid career with stats and trophies. It's about skimming across the surface of the system, opportunity after opportunity, always one step ahead of being found out. While other released kids put their boots away, Kaiser turns the rejection into a launchpad. The frustration that could have been the end becomes fuel for a persona that's getting sharper by the day. The player who doesn't play, but moves around like he's indispensable. Right there, between the pain of being seen as the worst with the ball and the decision to keep living as if he were a star, the core idea of one of the biggest frauds in football history is born. From that moment on, to him, it no longer matters what the ball says. What matters is what everyone else believes they're seeing. At Puebla's training center, the scene looks almost like a postcard from another world to a young Brazilian used to bumpy dirt pitches, well-kept grass, organized structure, coaches watching in silence, players in spotless kits. Among them, Carlos Henrique Raposo runs with the intensity he's learned to put on since he was a kid. Chest out, muscles on display, the posture of a seasoned professional. From the sideline, a Puebla scout watches closely. He doesn't write much in his notebook. Truth is, he doesn't need many words. What he sees is what the market values most. The body of a striker, presence in the box, a frame built for physical battles. A few weeks earlier, this same scout had been in Brazil, combing through training sessions and games in search of cheap opportunities. In one of the greatest talent factories in the world, he didn't find a new prodigy, but he did find something that, from a distance, looked promising. A strong forward, with stints at Botafogo and Flamengo on his verbal resume. Well recommended by someone he trusted. No one asked for game footage. No one demanded a detailed report. Back then, football still ran mostly on, "He looks good, let's bring him in and see." And Kaiser knew how to look good. The invitation to go to Mexico comes as confirmation of a theory he'd been quietly building. With the right body and the right story, doors open. For a kid who grew up poor, an offer from a foreign club means a lot more than just a contract. It means escaping anonymity, getting paid in strong currency, living the myth of the Brazilian player exported abroad. Torn between doubt and euphoria, he accepts. In 1979, he lands in a country he barely knows, with improvised Spanish and a polished sales pitch. He's a center forward, a penalty box striker, strong, a man for big moments. The first contact with professional Mexican football, though, is a brutal reality check. In sessions with the ball, the pace is faster than anything he'd seen in Brazilian youth teams. Tactical intensity, speed of thought, passing accuracy. Everything seems 2 or 3 seconds ahead of what he can deliver. In the first full squad practices, every bad first touch weighs heavy. Every miss-hit shot stands out more than all the fitness work he does sprinting from box to box. In that harsh spotlight, the first conscious tricks start to appear, no longer just instinct. Kaiser leans on one of football's oldest excuses, lack of match rhythm. He tells fitness coaches and managers that he's been a while without playing, that he needs more time focused only on physical conditioning, that his body is fine but his timing on the ball isn't back yet. And because his physique is impressive, the argument lands. The coaching staff convinces itself it's worth waiting a few weeks before really judging him in full training. In that window, he doubles down on what he does best, shining in physical drills. In the gym, He does every set with discipline, impresses in strength work, runs more meters than many teammates. In endurance drills, he's one of the first to complete the circuits. From a distance, he looks like an extremely dedicated pro, committed, an investment worth being patient with. His lack of real involvement when the ball is in play hides behind glowing notes in reports about his conditioning. When the staff finally starts pushing for him to join full scrimmages, a new layer of trickery comes in. On key days, little aches pop up at just the right moments. Tightness in his thigh, a nagging hamstring, a sudden pull during warm-ups. Nothing dramatic, but just enough to justify a trip to the physio, a request to take it easy, a few days in the medical department. In a time before MRI scans were standard at every club, before sophisticated tests, a player's word still carried a lot of weight. And Kaiser had learned exactly how to use that. While he avoids exposing himself with the ball, he builds relationships. He smiles at staff, treats masseurs well, chats up club officials, picks up Spanish phrases that sound good in casual interviews. In no time, he's seen as great for team chemistry, a friendly foreigner doing his best to adapt. His lack of minutes on the pitch blends into the club's daily routine, as if it were just a normal adjustment phase. But in professional football, patience always has an expiration date. After a decent stretch without being able to put the Brazilian on the field in any convincing way, Puebla's management starts doing the math. A foreign striker who never plays, always seemingly one step away from his debut but never quite getting there, slowly becomes a luxury the club can't afford. The administrative decision is cold. Terminate the contract, thank him for his professionalism, move on. And just like that, Kaiser's brief Mexican adventure ends without him ever truly establishing himself on the pitch. He practically doesn't play. He passes through the club like a well-conditioned ghost. For most players, a failed stint abroad would be a stain that's hard to wash off, an awkward chapter you avoid bringing up. For Kaiser, it becomes the exact opposite. Raw material. Back in Brazil, the story he tells about Mexico has nothing to do with timely injuries, lack of rhythm, or fear of the ball. He rewrites the narrative in bright colors. He talks about goals, about fans who adored him, about directors who didn't want to let him go, about interest from other Mexican clubs. In bars, locker room banter, and talks with agents, he learns to tweak the version depending on who's listening. For some, he was an idol in Mexico. For others, he had a good spell, but chose to come back for family reasons. The accuracy of the facts doesn't matter. The impact of the story does. The simple fact of having an international stamp, a foreign club on his resume, already changes how people see him. The word Mexico becomes a credential. In the process, Kaiser discovers something crucial about football in that era. Almost no one checks details. Journalists repeat whatever version they hear in the corridors. Club directors trust phone calls, recommendations, vague letters. Fans feed off rumors. There's no easy access database, no ocean of video footage, no social media dissecting every play. Between what really happened at Puebla and what he starts telling, there's plenty of comfortable room for fiction. That chance in Mexico, which could have buried his career by exposing his technical limits once and for all, ends up becoming the perfect lab for the scam. It's there that he tests for the first time a formula he'll repeat with variations for the rest of his life. Use an athlete's body as a shop window, hide the ball behind plausible excuses, and turn quiet failures into great feats in other people's memories. From that experience on, he comes back to Brazil not just as another ex-player looking for a club, but as someone who's learned, in practice, the devastating power of a good story in a world eager to believe without asking too many questions. Back in Brazil, Carlos Henrique Raposo was no longer just the kid cut from youth academies. He now carried a label that was pure symbolic gold: player with experience abroad. For club directors desperate to show they had good international connections, that alone was enough. When he reappeared at clubs like Botafogo and Flamengo, he didn't show up as someone begging for a trial. He arrived as a potential signing, a physical gamble, a strong center forward who comes from Mexico and just needs an opportunity. The script was almost always the same, like lines he'd memorized. Kaiser walked into the club in top physical shape, his body sculpted by hours in the gym, posture of a ready-made pro. In informal introductions, he spoke with confidence, quickly mentioned his supposed experience at Puebla, name-dropped coaches, cited teammates, not all real, but all delivered with conviction. For the coaching staff, the first impression was good. A striker with size, polite, communicative, apparently used to a high-level environment. When they asked about his match fitness, he rarely claimed to be 100% ready. He preferred calculated caution. He'd say he was just coming back, that he'd been out for a while, that he needed a few weeks to get back to ideal condition. The fitness coaches read that as a sign of professionalism, a player who doesn't force it, who respects his body, who asks for time to be at his best. And to be fair, he really did stand out in physical training. He ran more than many, nailed every set in the gym, inspired confidence. The problem started when the patience clock got close to zero. After a stretch of pure conditioning, the coaching staff wanted to see the ball make the decisions. That's when the first scenes of the ghost player began. On the very day scheduled for the most intense full-field session, Kaiser would feel a pull in his thigh, accelerating in an apparently simple sprint. He'd reach for his leg, fall on the grass, grimace in pain, lie there for a few seconds. Teammates stopped the play, the physio was called, and training went on without him. At that time, without MRI machines available at every club, and with imaging exams still expensive and rarely used for muscle issues, diagnoses depended heavily on what the player reported. If he said he felt a sharp twinge, pointed to the exact spot, complained of discomfort when putting weight on the leg, the protocol was always the same: pull him out, treat him, don't risk anything. Kaiser knew this better than most. He turned imaginary sensations into supposed injuries, always at strategic moments, usually right before situations where there'd be no way to hide how limited he was with the ball. That's when a key piece entered the game: the dentist friend. At a time when sports medicine still flirted with theories about infectious foci in the body as causes of physical problems, dental reports carried unexpected weight. An infection in a tooth, for example, could be blamed for recurring muscle pain, dips in performance, even a higher risk of injuries. Kaiser leaned into that with precision. Whenever a club started to lose patience, when coaches began to raise eyebrows at so many muscle problems, right on the verge of his debut, he'd pull the emergency cord. More tests, more detailed evaluations. Before those exams could actually go anywhere, the miracle report appeared. The dentist playing along would certify a serious focal infection, something that supposedly explained the delicate clinical picture. The player then had to treat the dental issue, step away a bit, take care of his health as a whole. To club directors, that speech was convincing. Here was a player who'd come from abroad, got along with everyone, showed professionalism in training, and was now a victim of a medical condition that couldn't be seen, but was documented. The combo of self-reported muscle injuries and convenient dental reports spun a web that was hard to challenge. At the end of his short contract, often just a few months, the club would quietly choose not to renew. The exit was low-key, with no scandal. And Kaiser moved on to the next stop, his resume untouched. At the same time, he understood that fooling coaches and doctors wasn't enough to sustain the character. He had to shape the eyes of the people who told the stories to the public, journalists. Using his communication skills and natural charisma, he drew close to sports reporters, radio commentators, newspaper columnists, always with the same strategy: be available, be likable, offer good locker room gossip. Over time, little notes started popping up in sports columns. Striker with a spell in Mexico training at a Rio club. Brazilian player who featured for Puebla attracts interest from foreign teams. Sometimes there were even mentions of supposed calls from the Mexican national team, inquiries from overseas clubs, offers under consideration. Nothing too detailed, nothing that could be quickly checked, but enough that, when added up, built an aura of a sought-after player. The media, hungry for curious stories and not very inclined to dig deep into the career of a guy who, in theory, was just one more among many, became his amplifier. A sentence tossed off casually in a stadium corridor turned into a little printed note the next day. A conversation about almost going to a European club morphed, in memory and ink, into he was close to signing with. The line between rumor and fact blurred once again. Through all this, Carlos Henrique Raposo carved out a peculiar kind of professional role in football. A player who moved around, signed deals, appeared in official photos, but almost never stepped on the pitch. The ghost player. Official stats barely show he existed, the fans' memories even less. But behind the scenes, his name kept circulating. There was always someone who'd heard he did well in Mexico, that teams abroad had wanted him, that he was recovering from a complicated injury. And the system itself made his life easier. Clubs needing to pad out their squads, directors who loved showing off their network, journalists who repeated stories without checking, doctors with no access to precise exams. All of that combined into the perfect environment for a serial con man to thrive. Kaiser simply stepped into the open space using charm, an athlete's body, convenient medical reports, and well-told stories to live off short contracts, without ever really facing the cold judgment of the ball rolling on the field. In the small stadium in Ajaccio on the island of Corsica, the scene feels like something out of a movie. Curious fans, improvised banners, club directors lined up on the touchline, and in the center a Brazilian with big hair, a tight shirt, and a calculated look. Carlos Henrique Raposo, Kaiser, is about to be presented to the French public as the new striker for Gazélec Ajaccio. For the people in the stands, it's just another chapter in the long tradition of European clubs betting on exotic talent from Brazil. For him, it's something else entirely. It's a threat. For the first time, the fraud is at risk in front of an entire crowd. The presentation isn't just a symbolic act. The club organizes an open training session with the ball, crosses, finishing drills, everything in front of the supporters. Kaiser knows that here it's not enough to run around the pitch or fake an injury. Under the eyes of hundreds of people, any bad first touch becomes obvious. The solution he finds is as unlikely as it is effective. He turns his own lack of skill into a show. Instead of trying to control the ball, he blasts every pass he receives straight into the stands with power and deliberately poor aim. Every time the ball lands in the crowd, the fans cheer, happy just to touch it as if they were part of the spectacle. Between one missed shot and the next, he kisses the badge, waves, thumps his chest, and pulls the crowd to his side. What could have been a technical disaster turns into an emotional performance. To the fans, that Brazilian forward who keeps sending the ball to the people, who celebrates every contact with the stands, looks like someone in love with the club from day one. He doesn't show a single bit of real technique, but he oozes charisma, theater, and staged passion. By the end of the session, no one is talking about how many shots hit the target. What sticks is the feeling that a captivating character has just arrived on the island. That story, repeated and amplified over the years, became one of the most famous anecdotes tied to Kaiser's name. But it doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a larger, murkier plot involving supposed stints at Argentine clubs like Talleres and Independiente, episodes where the line between truth and invention becomes almost impossible to trace. In interviews, he talks about locker rooms in Cordoba and Avellaneda, about intense clásicos, about brutal training sessions in Argentina. He name-drops teammates, opponents, coaches. The narrative is rich in detail, maybe a little too rich. What's concrete, in many cases, is limited to conflicting scraps. Some documents suggest very brief links, possible contract notes, trial periods, registrations. Nothing that proves consistent participation in official matches. Former teammates, when asked years later, don't all say the same thing. Some vaguely remember a physically imposing Brazilian who showed up and disappeared quickly. Others are harsher. They say he never truly wore the shirt in a real game, that his presence was more in the background than on the pitch. Reality, at that point, depends heavily on who's telling the story. In France, that ambiguity gains a new layer. There are photos of Kaiser in Gazélec Ajaccio's kit, records of him at the stadium, in club interiors, posing alongside directors. To outsiders, that's proof enough. If there's a picture in the uniform, if there's an image on the pitch, then he must have been a player there. But when former players and staff are interviewed, versions emerge that tear down part of the myth. Some say he never got beyond being a kind of long-term guest, that he trained very little and played even less. There are accounts that he got close to the board, secured access to official gear, took photos, and from those images, stitched together an entire European chapter for his past. The suspicion of forged documents, inflated resumes, and contracts used more as social currency than his professional record appears again and again in testimonies. It's not just about inventing a club here and there, but about creating a web of proof just strong enough to make the stories sound plausible. At a time when, for most people, checking any of this would mean calling some club in another country, finding someone willing to dig through dusty filing cabinets, the scheme found almost perfect conditions. Almost no one went to that trouble. And so, the invented life in Argentina and France becomes one of the central pillars of the narrative Kaiser builds about himself. When he returns to Brazil, backstage conversations start to include references to international experience in 3 countries: Mexico, Argentina, and France. Each country adds a different varnish. From Mexico, he borrows the image of the foreigner who adapted to local grit. From Argentina, the aura of intense, hard-fought, blood and sweat football. From France, the European charm, the exotica of Corsica, the presentation in front of a passionate crowd. Looking back at this period, the border between what can be proved and what's purely fabulous gets narrower at every step. Yes, there are traces here and there, but most of the power of these episodes lies in the way Kaiser himself tells them, and in the way the football world absorbs and repeats those versions. His self-mythology feeds on gaps. Wherever facts are missing, he paints them in with color, drama, and punchy one-liners. And unlike what you'd expect in a conventional career, this fog doesn't damage his reputation. On the contrary, it makes him more interesting. The Argentine-French chapter of Carlos Henrique Raposo's journey is, in the end, less a linear record of games, goals, and trophies, and more a living exercise in fiction applied to his own biography. That presentation in Ajaccio, with balls rocketed into the stands and the badge kissed over and over, works as a perfect metaphor. Instead of delivering football, he delivers narrative. Instead of displaying technique, he offers emotional spectacle. Instead of building a career on numbers, he builds a persona on photos, short-term contracts, and stories that are nearly impossible to verify. In the end, you're left with an uncomfortable feeling. It may never be possible to know with absolute precision how much of what he says about Argentina and France actually happened that way, and it's exactly in that gray zone that his figure grows stronger. Kaiser's career doesn't rest just on paperwork. It rests on something more intangible, and at the same time more powerful. His ability to turn any tiny trace of reality into a convenient legend, always sailing between what was, what could have been, and what it's useful for others to believe that it was. At Bangu, Carlos Henrique Raposo's fraud found a stage perfectly suited to his script. A traditional suburban club in Rio de Janeiro, living under the shadow and money of one of the most powerful and feared figures in Brazilian football at the time, Castor de Andrade. Bookmaker, patron, benefactor, boss. At the club, his word mattered more than any contract. He was the one who built squads, paid wages, bought reinforcements, and decided the fate of players and coaches with the same ease he had to stop a training session on a whim. Kaiser arrived at Bangu with the usual package: impeccable physique, padded resume, stories about stints in Mexico, Argentina, and France. In the eyes of the board, he was just another forward who, if things went well, might turn into a bargain. If not, he'd leave quietly. In the first days, he followed the script he'd already mastered. Charming in the hallways, friendly with staff, intense in the fitness sessions, and whenever talk drifted toward the actual ball, he fell back on lines about adjusting, conditioning, and needing a bit more time to adapt. The problem was that there, The clock ticked at a different speed. Castor de Andrade was not a patient kind of president. He liked results, spectacle, new faces on the pitch. A striker who only trained, ran around the field and never debuted quickly started to look like a waste of money. And waste was something the patron didn't tolerate, especially when the team wasn't doing well. The most famous episode from that spell came in a match where Bangu walked onto the pitch already under pressure. The stands weren't packed, but frustration was thick in the air. The team was losing, the football was poor, and the insults started raining down hard on players and coaching staff. In the middle of the stand, in a special box, sat Castor. He watched, smoked, made comments, until he decided to act. He called the coach over and gave a direct order, leaving no room for debate. It was time to put on that Brazilian striker, the reinforcement, the strong center forward who'd only been training. Kaiser had to go in. The message came down from the box to the bench with the urgency of a decree. The coach, who knew exactly what the player could and couldn't do, hesitated inside. But on the outside, he had no choice. He called Carlos Henrique over, pointed at him, and told him to warm up. It wasn't a request. It was an order backed by the power of someone who could get the coach fired if he said no. When Kaiser heard he was going in, he didn't just feel the usual pressure of responsibility. He felt panic, the panic of a man who knows exactly what will happen when the ball hits his feet in front of an angry crowd and an impatient patron. The whole con was on the verge of collapsing in a single play. He couldn't fake an injury in the middle of the pitch with so many eyes on him. There was no time for focal infection, no dentist's note, no fitness excuse. If the scam was going to survive, it would have to adapt in real time. As he ran up and down the touchline, supposedly warming up, his eyes drifted away from the ball and toward the stands. And it was there, in the crowd, that he spotted his opening. A group of fans, fired up by the state of the game, were hurling abuse at the players, the shirt, the club. Shouts that mixed anger, frustration, and outright insults. For any other player, it would have been just another rough day in football. For him, it was an opportunity. The decision came as quickly as the desperation. Instead of getting ready to go on, Kaiser fired back at the fans. He shouted back at the insults, provoked them, started an argument. In a matter of seconds, the war of words turned into shoving, and the shoving turned into a full-blown scuffle. Players, subs, and security staff rushed over to break it up, and the referee, seeing the chaos, ran to the touchline. In his report, it was simple: a player involved in a confrontation with supporters. The punishment was automatic: straight red card. The striker who'd just been told to come on was sent off before even stepping on the pitch as a substitute. He didn't touch the ball. He didn't take part in a single play. He vanished from the match but stayed at the center of the story. The absurdity of the situation drew immediate attention. To the referee, it was a clear case of indiscipline. To the coaching staff, it was one more headache on a disastrous afternoon. But for Castor de Andrade, the story reached him from a different angle. In the locker room, after all the tension, Kaiser knew he had to control the version of events. He couldn't be the guy who dodged going on the field by starting a fight. He had to be something else. And he chose what that would be: the man who defended the club's honor. In front of the board, and above all in front of the patron, he said he just couldn't stand hearing fans call Bangu a small club, humiliating the team, cursing the institution. He claimed he reacted out of love for the shirt, out of respect for the club, because he refused to let anyone talk that way about his teammates. The speech hit a very sensitive nerve. The vanity and ego of a boss used to seeing Bangu as an extension of himself. Castor didn't see himself just as a financier. He saw the club as a symbol, a badge of respect, proof of his power. Hearing that a new player was willing to get into a fight to protect Bangu's honor resonated deeply with his worldview. What, from any other angle, would have been punishable indiscipline now looked, in his eyes, like an act of loyalty. Instead of being punished for the red card, Kaiser was praised. Instead of having his contract torn up, he got it renewed. The scene that could have finally exposed his lack of football, a debut in a tough match under pressure, was replaced by a sending off before his first touch. The con not only survived its biggest risk so far, it came out stronger. That episode is almost a perfect lesson in how the scam fed on the weaknesses of the system itself. Faced with the patron's impatience, Kaiser didn't finally try to prove himself as a player. He rewrote the terms of the game on another field, the symbolic one. Instead of delivering technique, he delivered a story of courage. Instead of dribbling defenders, he dribbled expectations, turning cowardice, the fear of going on, into an act of supposed bravery. It also shows just how easily the vanity and ego of powerful club bosses could be exploited. Kaiser, a man used to being feared and revered, chose to see in that gesture a reflection of his own worldview. The guy who doesn't swallow insults, who goes on the offensive, who doesn't let anything slide. By doing so, he helped prop up the career of a striker who, even in one of the most decisive moments of his life, managed the impossible, to remain a footballer without having to actually play. In the years following his spell at Bangu, Carlos Enrique Raposo became an almost constant presence behind the scenes of Rio football. Not as a protagonist on the pitch, but as a figure who kept showing up in photos, on the benches, in the corridors of clubs like Fluminense, Vasco da Gama, and America RJ. He never stayed anywhere for very long, but he was always around, always in shape, always in official tracksuits, always with a ready-made story about the next step in his career. What kept him going more than any technical promise was a very specific reputation: being good for the locker room. In a world where tensions explode over late wages, egos, defeats, and outside pressure, having someone who keeps the mood light is a quiet asset. Kaiser told jokes, mimicked directors, broke the ice in training camps, listened to people vent, carried stories back and forth without necessarily exposing anyone. He wasn't the guy who decided matches, but he was the guy who held things together in the banter. That social skill slowly became his main calling card. When a coach asked a veteran player if he knew a cheap striker who's good for the group, his name came up. Not as a promise of goals, but as a recommendation for chemistry. He doesn't cause trouble. He doesn't drink. He doesn't stir things up. He helps keep the squad united. In an environment full of inflated egos, someone who isn't fighting for the spotlight on the field, but who organizes the circle of conversation, has value. It was in this phase that one of the most curious symbols of his con appeared: the toy cell phone. At a time when cell phones were still rare, expensive, and almost non-existent among players in Brazil, Kaiser showed up with a device that, from a distance, looked like a sophisticated model. In his pocket, in his hand, on the table during team camp, he displayed it with carefully calculated nonchalance, as if it were just another item for someone used to negotiating with agents and foreign clubs. The act didn't stop there. In club hallways, hotel lobbies, and restaurants, he would answer calls in English or French, languages he only knew in scattered, memorized phrases. From the outside, teammates, directors, and staff saw a very clear picture. A player constantly on the phone with people from abroad, turning down or weighing offers from foreign teams. On the inside, what actually existed was improvisation, disconnected words, the names of clubs pronounced well, but with very little substance behind them. The image worked. At some clubs, the perception was that Kaiser was always in someone's crosshairs. That helped explain, in many people's minds, his short contracts. It wasn't that he didn't stay because he failed to perform. He didn't stay because he was always about to leave, with better offers on the table. The fiction gained consistency thanks to the visual support of the cell phone. In a culture that associated expensive phones with power and status, the toy became a prop of credibility. But not everyone was impressed. At one club, a detail broke the illusion. A team doctor, fluent in English, started paying closer attention to the scenes. One day during an especially theatrical call, he walked over, waited for Kaiser to hang up, and, in a casual tone, started talking to him in the same language he'd just pretended to be negotiating in. The reply came out broken, evasive, almost non-existent. The doctor realized immediately. The self-proclaimed polyglot who was supposedly turning down international offers couldn't hold a simple conversation. The suspicion hung in the air. That near exposure showed the limits of a strategy based on appearance and acting. In environments where no one tested the story, it held up easily. When someone decided to confront it in a practical way, the cracks appeared. Even so, the revelation never exploded into scandal. The doctor, more intrigued than outraged, kept his impression to himself. The club, with bigger problems to deal with, didn't turn the episode into a moral crusade. Kaiser once again slipped through the gap left by other priorities. Amid the tricks and lies, there was also a side to his story that can't be explained only by cold calculation. At one point, he was hired partly for a reason that fell outside the logic of the con, to help a teammate who had serious problems with alcoholism. Kaiser, who didn't drink and had a reputation for keeping a certain discipline off the pitch, was seen as a good influence. The board believed that having him around could work as a barrier, company, support. In that role, he wasn't a con man. He was a friend. He went out with the teammate, tried to steer him away from bars, took drinks out of his hands, kept conversations going to distract from alcohol, did what he could, within his limits, to keep the other guy at least somewhat protected. The locker room noticed that effort. Some players began to see him not just as the striker who never played, but as someone willing to spend time and energy to keep a teammate from falling even deeper. That human side complicates the easy label of cold scammer. Many of those who spent time with Kaiser would later say he was loyal, that he helped people with money when he could, that he stood up for teammates in arguments with directors, that he showed up in hard times. His role as locker room entertainer wasn't limited to cracking jokes. It included listening to vents about family, career, and frustration. While he tricked the system with contracts and toy phones, he built real bonds with real people. From Fluminense to Vasco, from America RJ to the brief adventure at El Paso six-shooters in the United States, the logic repeated itself. Little or no meaningful record on the pitch. Lots of circulation in the background. In the US, the exotic appeal of having a Brazilian striker in the squad helped shape the narrative. In Rio, being close to big names fed the idea that he'd always been among the greats, even if he almost never appeared under the lights of an official match. The toy cell phone era symbolizes that specific moment in Carlos Henrique Raposo's career, a period when appearances were no longer limited to his body and resume, but expanded to gadgets, staged foreign languages, and theatrical gestures. At the same time, it was the phase in which his social role inside clubs solidified. A scammer to some, a protector and friend to others, he occupied a paradoxical space. The player who fooled the system, but who, inside the locker room, was often genuinely there for those who needed someone at their side. When Carlos Henrique Raposo's career finally starts to dissolve, there's no official announcement, no press conference, no farewell in a packed stadium. There are no stats to show, no memorable goals to open sports news shows. The con doesn't end with a big final act, but with something almost invisible. No more contracts, recommendations drying up, and the natural aging of a body that had always been his main selling point. Clubs, little by little, stop calling. The short-term deals become rare. The generation of players he used to hang around with starts retiring, coaches change, directors are replaced, and the name Kaiser slowly disappears from backstage conversations. Without the push of youth, without the same ability to sell himself as a prospect, the character who wore so many shirts starts to fade out of the picture. There is no scandal, no explosive expose, no dossier tearing everything down at once. There is only the silence that usually swallows those who don't have real achievements to hold their own legend up. Far from the pitch, Carlos Henrique reinvents himself once more, this time in a much less spectacular way. Years of gyms, physical work, and athletic preparation, even if used as part of the con, become the foundation of a new job: personal trainer in Rio de Janeiro. Instead of club locker rooms, now it's weight rooms. Instead of directors and agents, regular clients chasing health, looks, conditioning. The stage shrinks, but the persona remains. Talkative, charismatic, full of stories about the time he was a player. For a while, his trajectory seems destined to stay locked inside the hazy memories of the people who had been around him. A former teammate remembers some locker room banter. Another tells the anecdote of the presentation in Corsica. Someone else mentions that striker who never played. Some fragmented stories, floating through bar tables and radio shows. Until, in a media landscape very different from that of the 80s and 90s, the figure of Carlos Kaiser is rediscovered. Younger journalists, curious about marginal characters in football, start getting interested in that almost folkloric name. A player who passed through big clubs, traveled the world, but left no consistent trail on the field. The more they look, the more they find a pattern of absence. Few official records, many conflicting accounts, an improbable number of clubs on his resume, and almost no meaningful minutes recorded. That gap, instead of pushing them away, pulls them in. It's perfect material for an investigative feature, and soon for a film. A British production company takes an interest in the story and sees something universal there. Not just about football, but about lies, identity, and the power of narrative. The result is the documentary, Kaiser, the greatest footballer never to play football, which turns this fringe character into the protagonist of a film screened at international festivals, including the Tribeca Film Festival in New York. On the big screen, the biography that used to live as murmurs in locker rooms becomes a structured spectacle, with testimonies, reconstructions, interviews, and clashing versions. The documentary doesn't just revive the most famous stories, like the red card before his debut at Bangu, the theatrical presentation at Gazélec Ajaccio, or the toy cell phone era. It also reveals how complex the man behind them is. Kaiser appears talking about himself with a mix of pride, irony, and self-indulgence typical of someone who knows he built an unlikely legend. Former teammates swing between laughter and criticism. Some call him a genius of trickery. Others, an opportunist who took up space that should have belonged to real talent. The film, rather than offering a final verdict, lays the layers bare. At the same time, a long-form book investigation digs deeper, rebuilding timelines, confronting versions, combing through documents, tracking down forgotten figures. The picture that emerges is of someone who, for years, skillfully exploited the cracks of a disorganized vein system with very little verification. The pages don't uncover great plays, decisive goals, or unforgettable finals. They do uncover short contracts, scattered records, posed photos, and a tangle of stories that lean much more on the listener's trust than on the teller's proof. Over time, Carlos Henrique Raposo's image settles into the global imagination with an accurate, almost ironic label: the greatest impostor in football. A footballer famous not for what he did with the ball, but for what he managed not to do with it while living as if he were a star. An anti-hero in boots, whose career was built far more in meetings, banter, and appearances than in official matches. And that's exactly where the story starts raising uncomfortable questions about football itself. Because Kaiser's trajectory isn't just an individual detour, an isolated anomaly. It works as a mirror, albeit a distorted one, of an environment where appearance, marketing, friendship, and narrative often weigh as much as actual performance. A system where recommendations matter more than careful observation, where an inflated resume opens doors that stats would never justify, where a good story told at the right moment can be worth more than a goal written on the match sheet. Looking back, you can see two competing readings of him. On one side, the view of the opportunistic scammer, someone who occupied space he didn't deserve, who took spots from talented players, who exploited the goodwill of clubs, fans, and colleagues to live off a gift he didn't have. On the other side, the idea that he was also a product and a symptom of a world eager to believe any narrative, as long as it comes wrapped in glamour, contacts, and strong off-the-pitch performances. Between those two extremes, his real legacy probably sits. He exposes, in almost caricatured form, how easily football can be seduced by the same forces that drive other arenas: fame, myth, image. In a later era of social media, media-hungry agents, and choreographed unveilings, the figure of the greatest player who never played feels less absurd and more prophetic. Today, more than ever, the distance between the player who exists on the field and the character who exists in the public's imagination is still being negotiated every single day. In the end, the man who spent a lifetime running from the ball became a symbol of something larger than his own inventions. His story forces football to face an uncomfortable question. How prepared is the game, really, to distinguish, with rigor, what is real talent from what is just a well-crafted narrative? And as long as that question has no clear answer, the legend of Carlos Kaiser Raposo will stay alive. Not for what he did with the ball, but for what he reveals about all those who, for years, preferred to believe he truly was a player. If this story about the greatest impostor in football made you see what happens off the pitch in a different way, don't let it end here. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with that friend who loves football and would totally fall for a character like this. And tell me in the comments, at what moment would you have gotten suspicious of Kaiser? Or would you have believed him right until the end?